Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having us, and it's a real pleasure to be here with this great organization talking. So JC called me and said that they had asked me if I could fill in, and Gil and Angela, it's great to be on the panel with them. Gil and as former Undersecretary, and Angela as Deputy Director General of the WTO. But they tasked me with, in 10 minutes, explaining what Trump's trade policy is so that everybody in the room can go home and explain it to everybody so it makes perfect sense. And I laughed and I said, we'll do what we can. But there is some background that I think is important here. And there is some logic to what's happening and where we are today. I'm not advocating for the Trump tariff policy. I'm not advocating against it, just to give some background so people know that the folks surrounding President Trump and his economic advisors today are all speaking with a similar kind of background. There's differences in their approach, but you have to understand what they're looking at. And they're not looking necessarily just today. You really have to go back, and Angela will touch on this, I'm sure, as well. You have to go back to World War II, and coming out of World War II, the recognition that trade was important. Trade is important, and the idea is people trade together, we create trading ties, people don't go to war. People, businesses, leaders will call up their president or their prime minister and say, knock it off, don't go to war, I've got investments in that country, I've got investments in this country. We want some interdependence. And coming out of World War II, there was also a recognition that North America was relatively unscathed. You know, the world, Europe and Asia, unfortunately, were devastated like they were. And if you look at the New World Order that came out of the time, we have all in the same time with the Bretton Woods Accords, the IMF, the World Bank, the GATT, which became the WTO, creating this new landscape. In the United States at the time, driving a lot of this through the Marshall Plan, also established the idea, and this is the mindset you have to put yourself in among this economic group of advisors, is the United States was benevolent at the time and said to themselves, it was self-interested, we need places where we can trade so we can sell our goods, but we also need to develop those markets. And so what we will do is open our barriers, open our borders, with the understanding that in time others will open their barriers and their borders. And as people are able to access, we will get to a new point where there's trading going on, and there will be open areas for us to trade into. Whole idea of the GATT and the different rounds that happen through the WTO or the pre-WTO and then ultimately the WTO, where you saw tariff rates come down, you saw services start to be addressed. What this group is looking at now, though, and this is what's important, it's underlying a lot of the tariff discussion, is the trade in goods. And people always say, what about trade in services? Trade in services is a small portion when you look at the trade in goods. It's about a tenth of the overall trade in goods. So we'll just talk about trade in goods as a starting point. The United States, and what President Trump's team is telling him over, and he's very aware of this, is that there's a $1.3 trillion trade deficit in goods for the United States versus other countries. And everybody's aware of China being at close to 300 billion. These are 2024 numbers. But if you look at Europe, Europe has $235 billion with the trade deficit of the United States and Europe. And what the team around Trump is saying, and if you start listening to what Trump is saying in his post, I think they call them truth posts, and what they're saying in, when he's giving speeches, is in 1947, 1948, the United States said we were going to give access to the United States with the understanding that in time you would give access to your countries. Europe is essentially the same size, politically very similar, geographically very similar, similar mountains, similar latitude. You have populations that are similar size, you have a democratic base, you have opportunities for industry that are very similar. How then do you explain the $240 billion trade deficit? Other than there must be something other than tariffs that are in place. There must be something that's restricting access to the market. And so when Trump says, I need you to pay to have access to my market, that's what he's talking about. When he says there's disparity, there's unequal access, that's what he's talking about. Now, there are all kinds of arguments on the other side of that. But I think you have to appreciate why they're talking the way they're talking and what they're saying, and the policies that are driving the tariffs today. So the tariff policies today you know, it was when I started practicing with Gil, I was an associate when Gil was a partner at King and Spalding, and we had two things we had to worry about. We had to worry about the MFN rates, and we had a little bit to worry about China, because at the time China was still trying to negotiate, but it was a given. They were going to get MFN rates at the time. And then we had to worry about free trade agreements like at the time, the NAFTA. But it was pretty simple. Now what we have to do, when a client calls me and says, what about, you know, I've got this product, I ask, how much steel does it have for national security steel purposes? How much aluminum does it have? Is it coming from Europe? Is it coming where we have a side agreement with Europe, a free framework agreement? Does it have inputs coming from somewhere else? Do we have to worry about any other of these national security provisions? And so the attachments in the list of different reporting, you can have one good come to the United States and you have to report 8 different line items for that good from a tariff standpoint. The complexity has grown significantly, but it is all based around this idea of again, the mindset, not advocating for it or against it, but the mindset of you have to be in a position where you pay for access to our market, or you give me something for access to our market, so we get back to the idea of parity. Tariffs were the way we were, and they're not a dirty word. According to Trump, it's the big, beautiful word, right? It's the most beautiful word in the English language. It gives access to funds, it gives access to leverage for negotiations, and it also gives parity. Now, if you get to a point where you're talking to the United States or you're talking to other countries about parity, access to your market, access to our market, then you have a different discussion point. And I think you have to look through the lens that this group is talking to. So the other thing I was asked to talk about was just the stacking of tariffs, how they all fit together. Again, we have the MFN tariffs that we all negotiated down. Great for the world, very important for interconnectedness of the world. The United States, through national security, a carve out from the World Trade Organization, the GATT agreements, has put in place national security provisions under Section 232, one of the statutes we rely on. They have other provisions, like with respect to China, and there's an investigation with Brazil right now under Section 301, which basically in layman's terms is if you violate an international norm, the United States is going to take an action to try and bring you back into what they think the norm should be. Some would argue that should be before the WTO. Some would argue that the United States laws, it's okay for countries to act. It is clear under U.S. law that that can happen as long as the United States goes through a process. And then now we have these international Economic Emergency Powers Act tariffs that the Supreme Court is looking at. And then the takeaway, and I'll turn my time over and we can answer questions. If the Supreme Court is to say anytime now, we could get a decision day, we get one in 6 weeks. But if they are to say that the IEEPA tariffs are contrary to law, like 2 of the lower courts, the very next day we're going to have a different set of tariffs. There are other statutes that they can use. So the tariffs are not going away. It's a new regime we're under. I think this administration, if you listen to them very closely, and they're not hiding what they're saying, is they think 15 to 20% tariffs are absorbable. They don't think that's going to drive inflation, and they think that helps bring back that parity so that we've given away access to the U.S. market. It's one of the most valuable things in this administration's mind you could have. We have 1.2 trillion going out a year. We need to do something to bring some of that back. So either it's goods coming back in or it's tariffs coming back in, and that will help in a number of things. And the reality is, in these hallowed grounds we're in, and the Congress, tariffs are like drugs. Once you have money coming in, it's hard to give it back up. So we are in a new world. I don't think the tariffs are going to go away. They're going to look different, and they're going to continue to modify, and we'll reach a new level playing, not a level playing field, but a new norm. Depending on what the Supreme Court does, will be much more like today, or in 6 months we'll have a lot of chaos and we'll get to a new norm soon. But we're going to have a new norm we're working at. And I think Democrat, Republican, one other comment I have is when Biden took office, he raised the Trump tariffs, right? He raised the Section 301 tariffs on China. Whoever is next in line for the President of the United States, whether it be Democrat or Republican, we don't see anybody who's going to change the tariff regime. Probably going to stay about what it is. It'll be modified a little bit, but the direction we're in has changed significantly in the last 20 years. So, Angela or Gil?